Now moving on to Unit 5, or Chapter 5 in our book, in which we are going to cover two different kingdoms, the Protist Kingdom and the Fungi Kingdom. We'll start with the Protists, which cover a number of different living things. These animals, plant-like structures, are eukaryotic, which means they have a nucleus and multiple cell parts. Protists are one-celled organisms that have a nucleus and other cell parts. Protists can come in a number of different types, which we'll break down later on. They can be producers or consumers, so they can make their own food or they can get their food from other living things. They're bigger than bacteria, which we talked about last unit with the Monitoring Kingdom. To see them, you need to use. They're still very, very small. They can be one-celled. We'll talk about a little later on some different plant-like structures that are made up of cell chains. And there's three different phylum of protists. Some are plant-like, some are animal-like, and some are more like funguses. The animal-like protists that we'll talk about, we call them protozoans. Protozoans are one-celled animal-like organisms with a nucleus. The word itself, protozoan, comes from the Greek word that means first animal. These were once considered animals because they have a number of animal-like qualities, including the fact that they're consumers. These protozoans can't make their own food, which makes them like animals. They take in their food, they digest it, and just like animals, they reproduce. There's a few different classes of protozoans, and they're classified by the way they move. Some protozoans don't move at all, so we classify them in their own class. Some move with what we call false feet, which are like amoeba that we'll talk about. Some move with cilia, and some move with flagella. These are new words that we'll discuss in a minute. False legs, the cell will change shape. So when we look at something like an amoeba, which we'll talk about, the cell changes its shape and literally engulfs its food. It moves with this idea of false legs. They're not real legs because they'll change shape and everything else, but they help the amoeba to move. Cilia are like these little tiny hairs on the outside of a cell which move and in time help cells to move or help these protozoans to move. An example of that would be a paramecium. Some protozoans move with a tail. They have a big long tail at the end that moves back and forth and helps propel the protozoan or the protist back and forth. It'll move kind of like a whip. And these type of protozoans, some of them live in different animals' digestive systems. There's a few different special protozoans that we'll talk about. We're going to talk quite a bit about spores, and we have in our last unit a bit too, but there are some protozoans that we call sporozoans that reproduce by using spores, just like we'll talk about with fungi. Plasmodium is a sporozoan. You've probably heard of the disease called malaria, and Plasmodium is the protozoan that carries malaria. It's found in mosquitoes, and when mosquitoes bite a person, they're infected with malaria. You've maybe also heard of the idea of dysentery. It's a disease you get from drinking infected water or unclean water. It was much more common in the United States back in the 1800s. But a type of amoeba, remember we talked about those earlier, caused amoebic dysentery. There are also a number of plant-like protozoans, and they share many of the qualities of plants, but they're much smaller, and you'll see some differences in a second. They do produce their own food like plants, but they don't have a chloroplast. Algae is one that you've heard of, and it's very important to many marine ecosystems. They can have many cells, they can be multicellular, or they can have just one cell. Different types of algae have different functions. They do make their own food through the use of chlorophyll, which also gives them their color, but they don't have chloroplasts. Unlike plants, they do not have a cell wall. Remember, plant cells had a cell wall, but these either multicellular or singular celled plant-like protozoans do not have a cell wall. Their most important feature is that they produce oxygen in water, which that oxygen is used by other plants, by animals in the water, and they're very important to a marine environment. Some special plant-like protozoans, or protists I should say, are diatoms. They are one-celled organisms. They can come in a number of different shapes, and they produce. You would think they had chlorophyll. They do have chlorophyll, and they move all over in the water. They have a really strange structure, though. They have a cell covering made of two parts. It kind of creates sort of a lid. When they die, they fall to the bottom of the ocean. Sometimes we use these in toothpaste, scouring powders, and filters because they are good cleaners. Also, we use these diatoms in different types of paint. Dinoflagellates are algae that are usually found in oceans. There's not many of them that we find around here in fresh water, but we usually see them in different colors like reds or browns. They do have chlorophyll, but it's hidden by those different colored pigments. They have flagella and move about by using that whip-like structure that we talked about. You've maybe heard of red tides. These can be seen in Florida and other different places. These are caused by huge amounts of dinoflagellates. Sometimes if you eat shellfish that have taken in these red tides or consumed a lot of these, it could be very unhealthy because of the chemicals that they absorb. We see them in a number of different places, and they can be harmful to the plant environment. We are more familiar with green algae. There's a number of different forms of green algae, but they also are one-celled organisms that can kind of be moved about from place to place. They reproduce in many different ways. Some of them are multicellular. They can form long strands. You've probably seen this if you've ever been fishing or boating. One algae that you see quite often is the algae kelp. Kelp is something that we see sometimes if you've had mint chocolate chip ice cream. Sometimes kelp and different algae are used in the production of that. And they're used oftentimes to help thicken different foods. So these are things that we see quite often. Now let's move on to the fungi kingdom. When we talk about fungi or funguses, we often think the first thing we think of are mushrooms. Fungi are different than plants. We like to think of them like plants, but they're different in many different ways. Fungi can be producers or decomposers, and a decomposer is something that eats on something that has been broken down. They cannot make their own food. They can absorb food from the environment, but they cannot make their own food. Most are saprophytes. If you remember back to before, saprophytes are things that eat on things that have already died. But some are parasites, which we'll talk about and we deal with sometimes as humans. There are many different traits that define the fungi kingdom. They do have cell walls, which makes them just like plants, but they can't make their own food. The reason being because they don't have chloroplasts or chlorophyll. They can be one single cell or made of multiple cells. Their body structures we'll talk about are made up of things called hyphae. Hyphae are things that contain cytoplasm. They're usually divided by walls. They're made up of a network of thread-like structures, which you'll see if you ever look closely at a mushroom. Fungi reproduce by forming spores, which we've talked about, these little bitty seed-like things that kind of float through the air. If you've ever seen a puffball, which is a type of mushroom, if you crush a puffball, you'll probably see a cloud of spores that move on from there. And one thing that fungi do is they digest food outside of their body. We see fungi, if you've ever seen bread mold, the sporangium fungi produces spores called sporangia. There's structures found on the tips of hyphae that make spores. That's where this phylum kind of gets its name. These are the different phylums of fungi. If you can see, if you've ever seen bread mold, you probably left your bread in a warm, moist, dark place. That's normally where these type of fungi grow best. If we keep our food clean, if we keep it dry, we usually can prevent molds in bread, and there's also chemicals in most breads that help prevent mold. The next type is a club-shaped fungi. These are the type of fungi that you see when we think of mushrooms. The mushrooms you eat, the mushrooms you probably see in your yard or in the woods are club-shaped fungi. You have to be really careful not to eat mushrooms whenever you want, because some mushrooms can be very harmful, while some mushrooms are very helpful and very tasty. They're very important as a food. Some can cause death. Don't eat those wild mushrooms like we talked about. If you've ever seen rust, smut, which you find in corn, puffballs, these are all different types of club-shaped fungi. The final type, when we think of yeast or the things that help make our bread rise, we're talking about sac fungi. Sac fungi produce spores in sac-like structures. They reproduce by budding. Budding is where a small part of the original cell kind of contains itself and is used in reproduction. We use these to make bread, also alcohol. You've maybe heard of the medicine penicillin. That's another example of where sac fungi are used. The final type that we talk about are the lichens, which are kind of a little bit different than fungi. They're not parasites or saprophytes, sorry. They live on other organisms but don't cause them harm. This is also called mutualism, when one organism helps another and in turn gets help in return. A lichen is an organism with chlorophyll. It lives with an organism with chlorophyll, and they kind of help each other. The lichen sort of absorbs some nutrients and things like that, and in turn it lives with the organism that is produced by chlorophyll. So as you can see, there's a number of different type of fungi, number of different type of protists that we looked at. There's also two videos, one on protists and one on fungi, that I'd like you to check out when you get a chance. Thank you.